Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the conclusion to her work, The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir is going to raise the question, why does it seem inevitable that there has to be a battle of the sexes? Why can't humankind, divided into men and women, come to terms with each other in good faith? And the answer to this is going to come out of her existentialist philosophy and her diagnosis of a bit of double dealing, as she's going to call it, a bit of duplicity going on with both sides, both the male side and the female side, keeping them from being able to have some genuine recognition of each other. First, though, before discussing that, she raises the question, and she's doing sort of a survey of the ground that she's covered. She says that we've seen that in spite of legends, no physiological destiny imposes an eternal hostility upon male and female as such. So it's not our biology that's determining us to be stuck in this quandary. Biology matters. Male and female are different, and they are connected to each other through reproduction, and they are different from each other in ways that they don't fully understand and which introduce imbalances. But that's not the end of the story. And anybody who pretends that somehow biology determines everything is really operating in bad faith. So she goes on and she says, humanity is something more than a mere species. It is a historical development. It is to be defined by the manner in which it deals with its natural fixed characteristics, its facticity, and that's a French term that we often translate just as facticity. And that's a term that's particularly important within existentialist ethics. It means the things that we're stuck with. So, for example, my appearance or my maleness or my age in this case, which I'm not actually stuck with all that long because I'm going to be older later, but I'm never going to be young again, right? Unless there's some sort of sci-fi thing going on. All of that is part of our facticity. And our facticity for an existentialist does not determine us. We are working within the structures of that facticity, but it doesn't provide, you could say, the absolute last word on how things are going to go. So she says, even with the most extreme bad faith in the world, it's impossible to demonstrate the existence of a rivalry between the human male and female of a truly physiological nature. So if we reject that, where do we go next? Because we do seem to have this opposition and long-term hostility going on. She says, maybe their hostility could be allocated to that intermediate terrain between biology and psychology, psychoanalysis. Woman, we're told, envies man his penis and wishes to castrate him, but the childish desire for the penis is important in the life of the adult woman only if she feels her femininity as a mutilation, which Freud seemed to take for granted. But plenty of women and also female psychoanalysts have come along and said, maybe you're wrong about that part of the theory. Maybe you're extrapolating too much here. And so that's being rejected as well. She says that, maybe it's just a symbol of all the privileges of manhood that she wishes to appropriate when we're talking about the phallus or the penis or whatever, right? Any sort of envy would not be of having a biological part, but rather of having the functions that go along with it. So if that's not introducing some sort of inevitable hostility, maybe we have to look elsewhere. As de Beauvoir points out, her desire, the woman's desire, is much more ambiguous. She wishes, in a contradictory fashion, to have this transcendence that the male is accorded, which is to suppose that she at once respects it and denies it, that she intends at once to throw herself into it and keep it within herself. And then she says, this is to say the drama does not unfold on a sexual level. Further, sexuality has never seemed to us to define a destiny, to furnish in itself the key to human behavior. So sexuality is just one part of a much more complex picture for de Beauvoir. And all of the psychological or psychoanalytic or whatever other theories we want to bring to bear on this are really skirting for her around the central issue, which is that males are accorded a kind of transcendence that females are not being granted. Females are being pushed back into imminence. And she highlights this in many different ways throughout the work. So she goes on and says, what does sexuality do? It expresses the totality of a situation that it only helps to define. What is that totality? What is that situation? Here is where she comes to discuss efforts at some sort of getting past this or compensating for it. And then she'll talk about the duplicity or double dealing that's taking place. So she says that this titanic conflict assumes on Earth two totally different forms corresponding with two different moments of history. In the earlier moment, woman is forced into imminence. That is, woman is being treated as an object, albeit a certain kind of object, one that can provide recognition to the subject, which is male, which is allowed transcendence. There may be some rare occasions, or there may be some exceptions of that woman who's able to achieve transcendence, but it's against a backdrop of many other women who are treated as if they are not fully human, as being not even second-class citizens, because they're often not even citizens, are they? So she says the woman who is shut up in imminence endeavors to hold man in that prison also. Thus, the prison will be confused with the world, and the woman will no longer suffer but from being confined there. What does she mean by this? So a woman who has become objectified or reified, turned into a living object, or if we want to use Aristotle's sort of framework, we could say an ensouled tool. That's what he uses of the slave, but we could just as well use that of woman in this case. Being forced into being treated like a thing, having all of her being there in, say, the roles that de Beauvoir is going to talk about, like motherhood. There's an attempt to try to bring then the male into that and say, well, you're an object too. You are just my son, or you are just my lover, or you are just whatever it happens to be. So she gives some examples. She says, mother, wife, sweetheart are the jailers. Society being codified by man decrees woman is inferior. She can do away with this inferiority only by destroying the male's superiority. So she pulls him down to that level. She says she sets about mutilating him, dominating him, contradicting him, denying his truth and his value. Then she goes on and she says, in doing this, she's only defending herself. It was neither a changeless essence nor a mistaken choice that doomed her to imminence, to inferiority. These were imposed upon her. So what we have in that case is a kind of tragic situation. And if you think about the ways in which she's framing this, many relationships have indeed followed this sort of course that she is setting out, and neither person winds up being happy as a result. Is there another possibility? There certainly is. She talks about woman emerging into transcendence, and this is what, the feminist movement of her time she sees leading to. But that's not going to bring about a complete resolution either. Why? because it's not actually going to resolve all of the issues. She says, today the combat takes a different shape. Instead of wishing to put man in a prison, instead of pulling him down, woman endeavors to escape from one. She no longer seeks to drag him into the realms of imminence, but to emerge herself into the light of transcendence. But this is a problem, not because there's anything wrong with emerging into transcendence, but the attitude of the males creates a new conflict. It's with a bad grace that he lets her go. There's going to be a lot of resistance to this, and we see this in myriad forms, even in our own society today, where women quite often are not allowed to have the same sort of agency as men do, and are ignored, not listened to, right? She goes on and she says, how does the woman respond? She replies to his lack of confidence by assuming an aggressive attitude. It's no longer a question of individuals each shut up in their spheres. A caste claiming its rights goes over the top and is resisted by the privileged caste. So here we have two transcendences face to face. Instead of displaying mutual recognition, each free being wishes to dominate the other. The women who are seeking the transcendence that men have been granted emerge into transcendence, largely bootstrapping themselves or relying upon previous efforts of other women and perhaps allies among men. Men and women confront each other as two transcendences. Rather than attempting to come to some sort of terms with each other, they spar. They turn things into a zero-sum game, so to speak. And here is where de Beauvoir will talk about a certain kind of double dealing or duplicity going on both sides. Here's what she says. Many women, in order to show by their successes their equivalence to men, try to secure male support by sexual means. In this sense, they are playing on both sides, demanding old-fashioned respect and modern esteem, banking on their old magic and their new rights. This doesn't mean that women are all sleeping with men in order to, get some sort of temporary advantage out of this, but they might use attractiveness in some sense. They might use a sense of chivalry, right? And this is what throws a lot of men, not just in de Beauvoir's time, but in our own time, for a bit of a loop, because there will be some double dealing. It's not quite clear where you stand. Are we actually equals? That's what modern esteem would imply. Or are we back in this position where a woman can tell a man, man up. You need to grow a pair of balls. You need to do this and that in order to benefit me. But the man is not able to, or not allowed to say something similar, like, why don't you woman up, right? We don't have a phrase like that in our culture, in our lexicon. And so there's a double dealing going on. Correlatively, men are also double dealing, according to de Beauvoir. And, as the ones who are in a privileged position, their double dealing perhaps bears a bit more scrutiny and a bit more responsibility and criticism, because what are men doing? She says that, here we go. Man is also double dealing when he requires women to play the game fairly while he denies them the indispensable trump cards through distrust and hostility. Men might say, oh, we're all equal now in the workplace, or we're all equal in academia, or we're all equal in the family, or we're all equal in this respect. But I'm not going to treat you as if you're completely equal. I'm going to treat you with a kind of distrust or suspicion and hostility. I'll denigrate the things that you do. I won't count them as worth as much. And we might also add to this a sort of sense of entitlement. You might think of a man who says, yes, we share the housework equally, but then when you actually look at it, you notice that she's doing most of the caretaking of the kids, right? That just doesn't count as housework, right? Because it's not cleaning up or something like that. And we could go on and on and on. Now, both of these reinforce each other. And both of them allow the other one to say, well, if they're not going to be completely fair, if they're going to be double dealing, I have to hold on to my advantage. And this leads to another sort of tragic situation. De Beauvoir talks about this in great length. She says, woman is opaque in her very being. She stands before man not as a subject, but an object, paradoxically endued with subjectivity. She takes herself simultaneously as self and as an other, a contradiction that entails baffling consequences. When she makes weapons at once of her weakness and of her strength, it is not a matter of design and calculation. This has been imposed upon her, right? At the same time, when she is actively demanding her sovereignty, and no doubt this procedure is unfair tactics, but it's dictated by the ambiguous situation assigned her. Man becomes indignant when he treats her as a free and independent being and realizes she is still a trap for him, bringing him into her imminence. If he gratifies and satisfies her in her posture as prey, he finds her claims to autonomy irritating. Whatever he does, he feels tricked and she feels wronged. That's a very good way of framing it. He feels tricked, she feels wronged. And we could easily change those polarities as well. The woman could feel tricked. She did the things that she ought to do, and she's still not being treated as an equal. Man can also feel wronged. Those women are crossing certain boundaries that fairness and justice requires. And then we get the situation that she's going to describe. Here's how she frames it. The quarrel will go on as long as men and women fail to recognize each other as peers, as equals, and not equals just in a formal sense, but equals in the sense, a Hegelian sense, of needing to give each other recognition. There has to be a reciprocity there, a recognition of the other as a genuine self. Not just merely as an other, as another self. And de Beauvoir closes this section with a very interesting proposal. She says, that is to say, as long as femininity is perpetuated as such. Which sex is the most eager to maintain it? Women, who is being emancipated from it, wishes nonetheless to retain its privileges, and man, in that case, wants her to assume its limitations. Now notice that she's not saying femininity has to be gotten rid of entirely, but it has to be rethought if there's going to be some impasse beyond this battle of the sexes. And that's not just a matter of women having to rethink it, but also of men having to rethink it, and they have to work out and negotiate a solution that can be acceptable to both sides and pave the way for getting past this sort of double dealing.